Thank you for the invitation. For me, it's a great opportunity. I have been working, as Marie mentioned, I have been working in a book for the last many years. And I'm starting now to be able to present something, I think, more or less articulated and try it out. And so it's for me a great opportunity to have your reactions on some of the ideas. Now, what I want to do is first I will tell you a little story to situate where the concerns for that inform my book come from. This is a very personal story. Let's see if this works. Right. There you go. In the late 1990s, my parents bought a small plot of land in a town in southern Patagonia, which is where I am from, in a town called El Calafate. There was a very small town, but close to a very beautiful area where there is what is now a very famous glacier, Perito Moreno Glacier, Chaltén mountain, that is a very prized place for climbers to go. Anyhow, so they bought this place of land because my dad dreamed of becoming a self-sufficient farmer as he was nearing retirement. He had never done anything related to farming, but that was his dream. So they were going to move to there once he retired. But in 1990, my mom got a lymphoma. In 3 months, she was gone, and the land was left there without any sort of care for the next 10 years. So in 2000, so that was more or less the town. Maybe, what's going on here? The town, by the time they bought it, was very small. After the 10 years that elapsed between my mom's death and 2000, the town started to grow and was surrounding the hectare of land that he had bought. So my dad started to parcel the land and sell it off. And he left 2 small plots of land, one for my brother, one for me. In 2008, after many years of not having been back in this place that I call home, I went with my son, that was very little, and I sat in the plot of land that my father had left me, and this idea came to my mind of reburying my mother in that land and make a labyrinth garden and have it as a memory of her, of that place that was to be their farm. And so I thought, well, I'm going to tell this my dad. My expectation was that he was going to tell me that I was crazy. But he didn't tell me that I was crazy. However, he told me, well, if you do that, if you rebury your mother here in the land, this is no longer going to be an investment. You're not going to be able to sell it, ever. And on top of that, you are putting an obligation on your brother and your niece and your nephew, because who is going to take care of her when I'm no longer here? You live in Canada, you're putting an obligation on them. So after I reconsidered what he was telling me, I decided I was not going to do it. But the point is that I have told this story before to friends and acquaintances, but I didn't realize to what extent it really had an impact on, strangely, on the sort of concerns that I have been working for the last decade almost. In part, at first, what the event drew for me was something. It made clear for me something that I knew intellectually, but not affectively, and this was the idea that someone can feel an obligation to place. Now, for perhaps many of you, this is something that is nothing surprising. For me, it is, in part because the family history that we have passed on, the way in which we have defined our family, that has been mostly the patrilineal history of the family, has always stressed the immigrant origins of our family. We have a great-great-grandfather that came from Switzerland in the late 19th century and have kept moving through the country looking for a better life. Then the subsequent generations, like 4 or 5 cohorts after him, kept doing the same. And in a way, I had kept doing exactly the same too. Mind you that now I live as close to the North Pole as I was born to the South Pole. I mean, that's what it takes, $3,000 to go home. Google tells me. But paradoxically, so I have been, hopping from places to places, in one way or another, always looking for a better life. But I have been working for the last 30 years with people for which their very being is almost inextricable from places. So it was kind of a paradox, that, or perhaps no, I don't know, there is something there. So it is against this paradoxical background that my experiential glimpse into the affective dimension of obligation to place had a profound impact on me. Retrospectively, it brought very vividly the feeling of obligation that was conveyed to me when I remember an Yshiro elder told me in 1993 the reasons why his people were decided to recover a place. It was called Carchabalut, that the Paraguayan state had sold to an investor, to a private investor. And this elder, Tontito, told me the reason that they were so attached and feel obliged to the place was because there were generations upon generations of grandparents that were buried there, where almost every tree had a story to tell, where the animals were speaking to them, and where the anapsero beings were telling them to return. If I had felt a bit of a sense of obligation just by thinking of the possibility of burying my mother in that plot of land, I wondered what it would be to have the density of these obligations to a place as what this elder was telling me. But this glimpse also proved further illuminating in 2015 when I took part in a traveling seminar that was organized by a colleague, a geographer colleague of mine, Bruce Brown, to the heart of fracking country in the US, in the back-end fields of North Dakota. As we traveled through the area and heard city planners and economic developers, it called my attention how they were trying to handle some of the consequences of the oil boom that had attracted to the area an influx of male workers in a scale well beyond what the infrastructures of the cities and the towns around could contain. I have never seen the size of the parking trails that I saw there. I mean, it was really staggering. Hundreds and hundreds of meters of basically a town made of parking trails. Clearly, the infrastructure that accompanied the oil boom was transient. The place was being material and semiotically done as a frontier where everyone, from workers to corporation, was there to make big bucks and move out quickly. The effects in the landscape I can only describe as devastating. Now, to counterserve this, the towns were also trying to do another kind of place. Not a transient frontier, but a place to root in and raise families. So, beside that other landscape of destruction, you have this other landscape. There were a lot of real estate development with family houses, schools. There was even, this is an amazing gym, athletic center that even have a swimming pool that have a machine that may wave so that you could surf. Just picture that. And so, in short, what I saw in this place were two sets of infrastructures. that were being done that differentially encourage attachment and detachment to the place. The city planner strategy to foster attachments follow an established tradition the region had before, that have been offering since the 19th century to white settlers who were willing to start family homesteads along the railway that was being laid down at that time. Now, looked at from the perspective of the ongoing processes of the oil boom, it seemed to me evident that the infrastructures of attachment that had been developed during the 19th century period had not been robust enough that would move descendants of those families to question the consequences of the fracking boom on the land. In fact, we were told about many farmers that had moved to other places to live off the rent paid by oil companies for setting drilling wells on their family farms. And as I heard these stories, I thought of my father saying that if I removed my mother from the cemetery to rebury her on our farm, the land would not longer be an investment. And then it dawned on me how something as apparently unrelated as a cemetery could be part of the infrastructures that enable people like me or the farmers to relate to the land as a thing commensurable to a monetary value that could be realized anywhere. I use the word enable in this context to signal that even if neither myself nor perhaps the farmers may have liked to treat the land only as an economic investment, knowing that our death will be undisturbed in the cemetery helped us accept via compensation process that make the land just that, an economic investment. Of course, compensation simultaneously normalizes the notion that the land has above all an economic value, and concealed histories of displacement and destruction of much more robust infrastructures of attachment that base on, for example, generations upon generations of grandparents that are buried in a place, storied trees, communicative animals, and commanding more than human beings, will make it an unescapable obligation to refuse the idea that the main value of the land is as an economic investment. In fact, a few months after we visited the Bakken fields, such obligations prompted many Standing Rock Sioux of North Dakota to start a protest that probably most of you have seen in the news against the DAPL. The dynamics between what I call infrastructures of attachment to and infrastructures of detachment from place is one of the concerns that underpins my book. It is my contention that infrastructures of detachment from place proliferate everywhere, weakening and displacing infrastructures of attachment to the point that for many it has become very difficult to realize visions of a good life premised on attachment to place, while for others it has become unthinkable to imagine a good life that is not premised on detachment from place. This has expansive consequences, one of them being that the possible answers to the fundamental political question of how to live together, what will hold together a political community, at what scale and with what scope, that question has been narrowed, or the answers to that question. And so it's precisely a desire to expand the range of possible answers to these questions that informs what I'm trying to do with this book. Now, within the North Atlantic and South American scholarly and activist discussions that I most assiduously follow and participate in, there are two topics of debate over which this question of how to live together hovers more or less explicitly. And these topics are the Anthropocene and the commons. Now, the relevance of each topic in public debate differs in the North Atlantic and in South America. The Anthropocene has become quite the hot topic here in the North Atlantic, but discussions of the commons, although they are present, they are not so hot. And the reverse happens in South America, where the commons is a quite hot topic, and the Anthropocene is not yet that hot. Though there is an issue of the geopolitics of knowledge that makes that the topics that are hot in the North Atlantic eventually are going to become the hot topic in South America too. Now, precisely because the same fundamental political question hovers over both in rather different settings, these two topics are mutually illuminating in terms of how they exceed each other. In this regard, I will only say for now, and we can discuss later more about this, that the topic of the Anthropocene foregrounds the issue of the non-human, which are not very prominent in discussions about the commons in South America. Conversely, the topic of the commons foregrounds questions of scale and scope that are often under-discussed in the debates about the Anthropocene. But I argue that, these topics are also illuminating in terms of what they mean, in terms of possible answers of the questions of how to live together. And it is when we look at these topics from the perspective of what I call life projects of emplaced collectives that we can fully see these elements that are missed from these discussions. So, and this has been a long introduction to get into my talk. What I propose to do for this presentation is I want to sketch out for you what do I mean by life projects and emplaced collectives, and how these concepts relate to the notion of political ontology, and how all these open new vistas to this fundamental, new vistas and new possible answers or different answers to this fundamental political question of how to live together. I want to stress that I'm just going to sketch these ideas here so that give us an anchor to have a discussion afterwards. And this is really what I really want to have, is the discussion. After the presentation, we can think collectively to what extent these concepts that I'm going to try to present for you do work, are helpful or perhaps not, for understanding what's going on in the South and in the North. And probably, hopefully, maybe we come back to the topics of the Anthropocene and the commons in that discussion, okay? Now, I have to do another caveat before I really get into my presentation. I need to clarify some points given the examples and the sources that I use to characterize life projects and emplaced collectives, because they might generate some misinterpretation. My reliance on examples and sources that for many of you are going to look like they come from the field of indigeneity reflects my professional trajectory that made me more familiar with this field than with others. But I want to emphatically reject an interpretation of my arguments about emplaced collectives, their life projects, and their politics as implying an inherent relation, an inherent association between them and a particular identity group, namely indigenous people. This does not mean that issues of identity play no role in the politics of emplaced collectives and their associated life projects. In fact, these issues are often mobilized as leverage at different junctures, also in very different ways in Latin America and in Canada and the US. Yet the mobilization of identity, I think, tells more about the purchase that certain categories of differentiation, such as ethnicity, class, race, gender, and so on, have in the terrain of mainstream politics than about the practices that characterize the life projects of emplaced collectives. So keeping this in mind, I want to stress that the key issue that concerns the characterization that I'm going to offer you are the practices, the life projects, through which emplaced collectives bring themselves into being, rather than the particular identity label to which their human participants or components might be ascribed to. So also, they are often entangled for a number of interconnected reasons that we can also discuss in the discussion time. I find that it's important analytically to distinguish the politics of emplaced collectives from the identity politics component of indigeneity. The question of the relation with these two kinds of politics is a very important one, but I think that it can only be discussed if we establish the distinction first. So, made the clarification and made the introduction, let's get into the question of what life projects and emplaced collective mean and what their relation is to what I call political ontology. I first heard of the idea of life project from Bruno Barras, also a leader of the Yshiro people from Paraguay. He used the term to draw a contrast between the visions of a good life sustained by his people and those promoted by state agencies under the guise of development or modernization. Interestingly, the contrast that he drew was not about the putative content of those visions of a good life, but about their grounding and their orientation. He took at face value the claim of their proponents that development projects were intended to bring the good to the Yshiro, but he thought that they continuously failed in this purpose because the vision of the good that oriented them emerged from other places and experiences and disregarded the reality the Yshiro lived in. He argued that the Yshiro Life Project, in contrast, emerged from and responded to the specificity of that reality. And it was to these life projects where the efforts invested in development projects should go. Now, what the concept of life project made evident for me was that the Yshiro visions of a good life were emergent. They had their own roots in the specificity of the Yshiro lives and place. Of course, after the case of colonialism, developmentalism and its effects were part of that specificity, but they were only a part. In this sense, the concept of life projects made possible for me to understand the particular relations that a group, community, or collective could have with the agenda of development/modernization, without assuming that that relation determined the shape of those collectives' stories and visions of a good life. In other words, the concept allowed me to look into the entanglements between life projects and modernization and as visions and stories of a good life, while still retaining a useful distinction between them. And that distinction hinged upon their different orientations. For the agencies promoting it, the story of the good life embodied by notions of development and modernization does not emerge from a particular place and set of experiences. It's a universal. In this context, the term life project can operate as a conceptual placeholder for stories and practices of a good life that are bound to be different among themselves, precisely because, in contrast to the purported universalism of development, they share a primary orientation to the specificity of places and experiences. I say that life projects embody small stories about the good life. Stories that, rather than assuming or even aspiring to the status of universal, are fundamentally concerned with enhancing their own plausibility amidst and along other stories of a good life. Of course, it is important not to lose from sight that speaking of story, in this case, when we are talking of stories, it's like Leroy Littlebird has put it, not just about the words and the listening, but the actual living of the story. In other words, the stories and visions of a good life, including those that go under the label of development and modernization, are not only, or not mainly, narrations, but are also concrete practices, world-making practices. In my book, I first focus on the life projects associated to what I call emplaced collectives, because as visions and stories of a good life, they offer me the strongest contrast to developmentalism and modernization. In South America, the vision of a good life associated with developmentalism is pretty evident and obvious in debates around the commons, particularly in the context of what has been called neo-extractivism. In the North Atlantic, I argue that the Anthropocene reflects a kind of conceptual diaspora of the developmentalist modernization vision of a good life. Or to put it in other terms, the Anthropocene is, to various degrees that we can discuss too, a continuation of modernization by other means. Thus, having the developmentalism of modernity and the life project of emplaced collectives as coordinate, what I am intending to do in the book is to use that as coordinate that will allow me to map where other visions of a good life are situated and how they relate to each other. So what is an emplaced collective? And in which way can they be contrasted to modernity and its vision of a good life? As Latour has pointed out, the term collective contrasts with society in that the latter often refers to an association of humans, while the former refers to entire associations of existence, from humans to animals to spirits and so on. So it's the whole package. Probably you have seen this already in the courses that you have been taking. Now, all collectives are placed. That means they all have some form of grounding, even as they might disavow the point, which is what actually the modern collective does when it assumes itself being a universal. Thus, while a collective, such as the modern one, might conceive itself and the world as constituted by human societies that live in more or less interchangeable natural places, other collectives might distribute existence according to other categories that foreground the specificity of place. And this is the case of emplaced collectives that can be characterized as the emergent and open-ended effect of lived stories through which the webs of relations and attachments that give form to a particular set of existence sediment as place. It's a mouthful. Let's go slowly over them. So, a couple of things here. I use the word emplaced advisedly. I'm borrowing the term from geology. In geology, the concept of emplacement refers to the process by which lava intrudes in all the rocks, and it becomes part of the rock, of all their sediments, of all their moments of lava, in such a way that you cannot separate the elements unless that you subject them to tremendous process of mechanical and chemical interference until you can pull them apart. So when I think of emplaced collectives, the first image that comes to my mind are situations in which, let's call it for the moment, human persons will rather die than see themselves separated from the collective, or would rather die than see the non-human persons that are part of their collective destroyed. So this is the first image that comes to my mind when I'm thinking of emplaced collectives. But here, let's go and stress the definition that I said. Emergent and open-ended effect of lived stories, through which the webs of relations and attachment that give form to a particular set of existence sediment as place. That they are the emergent and open-ended effect of lived stories means that emplaced collectives are dynamic in two senses. Their scale and scope is variable, and so is their intensity. Emplaced collectives are shaped by dynamic practices, regardless of how widespread those practices are among what we might call their human components. In other words, an emplaced collective will not necessarily coincide with a community as we picture it in a human-centered perspective. In fact, it might involve only a few entities that we will categorize as humans. But by the same token, the less widespread are the practices that bring them into being, the less intense will be their presence for an observer. Given that they emerge from specific situations, life projects in general, and those that express and give shape to emplaced collectives in particular, necessarily differ from each other. What they share, as I said before, is a common orientation toward the specificity of their self-generating practices. And I contend that these self-generating practices are informed with variable intensity across the continent by three principles: the principles of symmetry, pragmatism, and care. Now, the principle of symmetry refers to the idea that everything, or almost everything, in the collective has personality and is valuable. Consequently, the valorization associated with the human-non-human distinction does not apply here in the same way that it does in the modern collective. A corollary of this principle is that it is not politically or ethically acceptable to systematically privilege some of the members of the collective in detriment of other members of the collective. Now, the principle of pragmatism refers to the idea that something is true if it is verified by experience to have sufficient explanatory power to enable the accomplishment of a task. Subtending this principle is the idea that life, or reality, is the unfolding story of a creative force ungraspable in its full magnitude and complexity. This force manifests itself differently in particular places, sites, and times, through agents that behave and relate to each other according to their own personalities or idiosyncrasies. In this context, true knowledge of reality cannot be universal. Nobody can assume to know the story of life beyond the limits of their own situated experience. The primacy that pragmatism gives to experience has as a corollary a certain humility or cautiousness regarding the scopes of one's own knowledge. Now, if the principles of symmetry and pragmatism are operative, we obtain an ethos, a way of moving through life, that assumes that all beings, even if we do not know exactly how, co-contribute through their living, and that is their specific configurations, their vital trajectories, their reciprocal relations. So they all co-contribute to the unfolding of the story of life. And here we come to the principle of care. We can start with a generic definition of care as including everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. This is a definition that I'm taking from Maria Puig de la Casa. But it's important not to lose from sight the complexities of the concept of care. To put it somehow simplistically and in plain words, care might involve affection and self-sacrifice, but also burdensome obligation and dread, as when dangerous situations require that we move with care about them. It is with these kinds of complexities in mind that we need to understand how the principle of care works in the context of the emplaced collective's stories of a good life. The existence of each emplaced collective results from the mysterious entanglement of divergent but equally crucial vital trajectories of a myriad of existence that are in the collective. Now, the word mysterious simply stresses the degree to which the entanglement is not accessible beyond experiences that are always necessarily partial and situated. In this context, acting with care becomes paramount, because in the story of life, divergence and heterogeneity do not constitute a problem to be overcome, but a condition that simultaneously demands to be dealt with and nurtured. And it needs to be deal with divergence and heterogeneity because relations with others are always consequential. And we need to nurture divergence and heterogeneity because it is only in and through relations that existence come into being. In this way, within the story of life, the principles of care, symmetry, and pragmatism end up forming a tight braid. Care implies a pragmatic, situated response to the challenge of remaining entangled with others in such a way that relatively symmetrical heterogeneity between existence can be sustained. And what goes for particular entities go also for emplaced collectives. For the relation between collectives has to be following the same principle of care. And this gives us another corollary, a general idea, that only if the emplaced collectives engage each other with care can the story of life unfold properly. Now, when the self-generating practices of emplaced collectives collide with practices that negate them, as it happens around particular projects or policies that turn components of a collective into resources for developmentalist agendas, ontological differences come to the fore. What I mean by this is that life projects and developmentalism collide not as different visions of the world, but rather as different practices of wording. They produce different worlds, worlds that are not necessarily compatible. And I underscore here, I'm saying they are not necessarily compatible. It doesn't mean that they are incompatible. I understand that for many of us who have been brought up under the shadow of the modern myth that there is one and only one external reality and many possible perspectives on it, it is extremely difficult to imagine how different concrete realities can stand in the same place at the same time. But we are not without resources to imagine this. In fact, many of these resources are available at the intersection of several theoretical developments in ethnography, science and technology studies, and indigenous studies. And it is from this intersection that my colleagues and I draw inspiration to develop this notion of political ontology. Oh, I missed one. Anyhow, so the point of the intersection between this ethnography, STS, and indigenous studies is a general disavowal of the ontological divide between nature and culture, which are the divide that undergives modern practices, and particularly how this gets expressed in modern knowledge practices through assumptions such as that when there is a disagreement about the world, at stake are different visions or perspectives upon a single world, rather than different reals. Political ontology works from the reverse assumption, that disagreements must be treated as involving different reals until proved otherwise. Now, simultaneous existence does not imply that wordings exist side by side, but rather that they exist entangled with each other through partial co-occurrences. And this illustration will help me make the point. I have been using this for a couple of years now, but I haven't found anything that helped me better to try to get this idea. So probably most of you know this. Looking to the left, bird. Looking to the right, a rabbit. Here you have a partial co-occurrence of the bird and the rabbit in the head, but the difference is not cancelled. The beak of the bird is the ears of the rabbit. Let's now imagine that the shape of each figure are the product of the practices that make different collectives, different wordings. In part, they occupy the same place, but they are not the same, and yet they do not cancel each other. Now, let's imagine that this co-occurrence happened with all the figures in this picture. and the head of one of them is the tail of the other, which is the wings of the other, and so on and so forth, until all they are entangled into each other as a big bundle. Okay? Here we start to approach the idea of a pluriverse of mutually entangled wordings. But we need one more imaginative step to grasp this idea better. Let's now imagine that we are inside that we are not looking at it from outside, that we are inside. And through our practices, including our practices as social scientists, we contribute to give shape to that. Not the least by sensing and responding appropriately to the points where the rabbit and the bird diverge, or when we find divergence. Mind you how difficult this is when there is no vantage point from where to see the whole picture, no? You can only rely on your own experience of divergence to sense that there is something else there that is not you, in a way. Political ontology seeks to work with and within these entanglements. And thus the label has three interconnected meanings. It refers to the gamut of power-laden practices that bring diverging worlds into being. It refers to a field of study that focuses on how these diverging worlds strive to sustain their own existence amidst their entanglements with each other. And it refers to a form of critique that works by carefully evaluating the kind of worlds that are produced by different kinds of practices, including our own analytical practices. Now, going back to the image of the rabbit pair, let's say that the rabbit is the modern world, and suppose that the rabbit decides that he can make better use of his ears and cut them without even realizing that at the same time he's cutting the bird's beak and probably killing it. Let's say that the ears are mountains or animals or natural resources in the rabbit world, but they are also ancestors, relative, powerful, and respected non-human persons in the bird's world. That is, they are entities without which it might be difficult, if not impossible, to live a livable life. In that case, the bird will try to defend itself. The rabbit may hear the complaints of the bird, but will dismiss them, for in the modern world of one reality, of one single world, ears are ears. Ears cannot be beaks. And even there can be, even exist a bird where there is only a rabbit. Now, through case studies in Paraguay and Labrador, a few chapters of my book look in detail into the complexities of these processes that I am presenting here with this very simplistic metaphor. I am particularly interested in showing how practices that are informed by debates about the Anthropocene, as well as various discussions about the commons, somehow play the role of the rabbit, suffocating and disregarding the practices that constitute the emplaced collectives represented by the bird in my example. In any case, now the fundamental corollary of the principles that inform the life projects of emplaced collectives that I mentioned before, namely that only if collectives engage each other with care can the story of life unfold properly, offers me an anchor point from which to critically evaluate these processes. In effect, from this vantage point, many of the crises and conflicts that characterize the present moment appear as the result of a colonial order that, whether under the self-professed, benign, and commonsensical banner of developing or modernizing the commons for all, or under the catastrophic banner of the Anthropocene and its associated urgencies, conceives itself as universal, as placeless, and is careless about the specificity of other collectives and their life projects. And here I want to make a brief parenthesis to say that this, for me, also applies to those hot narratives about the present moment that to some extent break away from some assumptions of modernity and come closer to some extent to the principles of symmetry and and of care of the emplaced collectives. And I have in mind here the conceptual work being done under the label of multi-species and more than human assemblages, vitalism, etc., etc. There are two ways in which this conceptual work might still fit coloniality. First, if we attend carefully to the devices that help to constitute these tropes, it is evident that the natural sciences are still conceived as the predominant spokesperson for non-humans. These narratives abound with references to biology, oceanography, physics, and the like. In other words, symmetry and care are mainly applicable to those non-humans that can be recognized by the natural sciences. These conceptions remain colonial insofar as they cannot see or hear the challenge posed to them by emplaced collectives formed by entities that are refractive to scientific corroboration. Ancestors and spirits being the most obvious, no? But there are many more. Second, even as people like Latour and Haraway, for example, that seek to open the framework of the more than human and multi-species to these other entities, the politics of their project diverge from the politics of life projects in orientation. While the latter remain concerned with their own specificity, when the life projects are concerned with their specificity, the versions of Latour were called compositionist or compostitionist, to use the compost metaphor of Donna Haraway, are concerned with the common world, with the planet, with the big story. This, I will argue, keeps open the door for the reproduction of coloniality under a different guise. I will return to this soon, but now let's come back to the current colonial order that is still mainly expressed under the banner of developmentalism and modernization. Assuming its universality, this colonial order denies existence to the otherwise embodied by other collectives, and thus, rather than simply excluding them to constitute itself as any order does, it tends to tame or eliminate any alternative it encounters, thereby disrupting the unfolding story of life. This whole process is experienced by emplaced collectives primarily as interruptions, obstacles, and outright eradication of the life projects that bring them into being. In other words, it is experienced as a suffocation of the pluriverse. And it is in response to the suffocation of the pluriverse that political ontology advances the pluriversal proposal. A proposal that, rather than being oriented to the big story, is oriented to the proliferation of myriad small stories. And I will close this presentation expanding a bit on what this challenge entails, on the challenge that this proposal entails. Why do I speak of proposal? Because from a political ontology stance, the pluriverse is not presented as something that exists out there, but rather as something that must be done on an ongoing basis. This is why, as a modality of critique, political ontology rejects the universalist project of modernity, not on the basis of claiming to have discovered a more real reality, let's say the pluriverse. Rather, the critique is grounded on the effect generated by living according to the universalist assumption, namely, a world where there is no place for the emplaced collectives. In contrast, life projects imbued with emplaced collectives' orientations to their own specificity produce the pluriverse all the time. They are producing the pluriverse all the time, just by existing. The trust on this orientation is not based on a claim of knowing the ultimate reality, but on grounded experience. For generations, emplaced collectives have generated themselves through pluriversalist stories, and the worlds that produce have been good ones to live in. I don't think we can currently say the same about the world produced by modern universalism. Now, the pluriversal proposal is paradoxical. It poses the radical heterogeneity of worldings as the basis of a common existence. As such, the proposal cannot sustain itself by other means than by enacting what it proposes, that is, by enacting radical heterogeneity. This is what the life projects of emplaced collectives have done and do, as far as they are able to sustain themselves. The challenge for us analysts is learning to craft stories that contribute to enact the pluriverse. That is, stories that dwell in this paradox. Again, I think that resources are available. And I find some in the way the principle of pragmatism is deployed in a story told by Dakota writer Charles Eastman and retold by Scott Pratt. So this is the story that Eastman tells. That a missionary once undertook to instruct a group of Indians in the truth of his holy religion. He told them of the creation of the earth in 6 days and of the fall of our first parents by eating an apple. The courteous savages listened attentively, and after thanking him, one related in his turn a very ancient tradition concerning the origin of corn. But the missionary plainly showed his disgust and disbelief, indignantly saying, "What I delivered to you were sacred truth, but this that you tell me is mere fabulation and falsehood." "My brother," gravely replied the offended Indian, "it seems that you have not been well grounded in the rules of civility. You saw that we, who practice these rules, believed your stories. Why then do you refuse to credit ours?" The all-Indian response signals a pragmatist commitment that contrasts with universalism. Rather than assuming that different stories have to compete to see which one is true or to see who can explain away the other, the stories are assumed to have local validity and are judged by their consequences. By believing the missionary's truth, the Indians accept the claims of what they seem to be, as what they seem to be, claims about a world in which there is a single creator God. As such, these new believers can engage the missionary claims in a variety of ways, including ones that expect experiential implications. What does this world we did not know of before imply for our world that is composed differently? How are our worlds going to relate to each other? Now, in this mode of engaging with others, we cannot present big stories. That is, stories that assume that they implicate or should implicate us all. This is perhaps one of the main concerns I have with the multi-species and more than human assemblage tropes, that while being in many regards fellow travelers of political ontology, I feel yield to the temptation of the big story. Let me conclude by saying that the pluriversal stance requires a refusal of this temptation and implies embracing the challenge of presenting the pluriversal proposal in a way that is self-consistent. That is, in a way that fosters and calls for what, paraphrasing Helen Berran, I call going on together in divergence. This is truly a challenge for which I am just starting to put some ideas together, so and it is as far as I have come to. So I'm going to leave the presentation here and open the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mario. It was really dense indeed.
Yes.